Now, one of the big debates in language development is really how actually we develop language at all. So there's a number of theorists that have waded in. One I've already sort of telegraphed to you in terms of how do we develop language. And one of the first people that suggested a possible way to understand language development was a guy by the name of Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky essentially, I know it's kind of a strange first name, but sure, it's a family name of some sort. But Noam Chomsky proposed the idea of what he referred to as a universal grammar. And his notion behind this was that children are biologically prepared to learn words and use grammar. And what he called this was a language acquisition device. Whoops, I got a G. Language acquisition device that is already essentially in place. Sorry, I got a little distracted there. Already in place when they're born, so it's innate. And he argued that children acquire untaught words and grammar at too fast of a rate to be explained solely by the learning principles, which was the other kind of perspective about it. So he basically contended that there was a universal grammar underlying all human language, and that was the key components of Chomsky's approach to language itself. Essentially, neuropsychologists have looked at children performing language during the first few years of life, and essentially Skinner's emphasis on learning helps explain how they acquire language as they interact with other people, but Chomsky's emphasis on a built-in readiness to learn language helps explain, I should say, why preschoolers acquire language so quickly. And so essentially, and let me back up here, we also have B.F. Skinner as someone who has weighed in, and essentially Skinner's approach is the application of learning principles in terms of acquiring language. And you can see this in a lot of ways in terms of how parents' voices change as they're interacting with kids, which perpetuates more language production and therefore more refined language production. And so B.F. Skinner was primarily a learning, basic behavioral learning approach. Chomsky suggested the opposite in terms of innate, and really what it comes back down to is that nature and nurture work together to produce the language that we know and use on a regular basis. So work together in language development. And that's, again, that's not terribly, that's old news for the most part. The other one, the other kind of key concept to understand is the idea of a critical period. And I can say to you with certainty that as I've seen missionaries go out from the agency I worked at, their kids picked up the language far quicker than the adults did. And it was really quite annoying. And actually some of the adults, some picked it up like a husband and wife team. The husband might pick it up very, very quickly. The wife may be a lot slower to pick it up, and the kids picked it up before both of them. And so there's what appears to be a critical period for learning certain aspects of a language. And you might make a case for how self-conscious adults might be I can remember going into when I made a visit to Venezuela, and I was a very rudimentary Spanish speaker. And I can remember going into just sitting at a cafe with a friend and asking for coffee. And that's not terribly complicated, but I was very self-conscious about my Spanish and what my grasp of it was, and that has a direct impact on actually learning language itself. And kids may not have that, and not to mention how fluid and accessible their brains are in terms of change. The other thing just to keep in mind too is in terms of the deaf culture itself. And I will put into this particular video for you to watch a woman who for the first time actually heard her own voice. And we see the very similar impacts on language learning, even when it is a signed language. We see similar milestones being crossed and language learning in the deaf world. You see, the silent language in the signing itself. You also see, interestingly enough, which I've mentioned before, is you also see the tip of the tongue experience, but in the deaf world, it's the tip of the finger experience where they can't pull out a word. And you see that also in the deaf culture as well. We've made some dramatic progress in the use of cochlear implants with some people who are totally deaf but are able now to hear again. The video I'll show you is also is a similar kind of electronic enhancement of this woman's hearing, and allows her to hear her own voice, which ultimately that's how we modulate our voice, as we listen to it ourselves. And when we do inflections or when we lower our voice or change the tone, that all is from our own self-monitoring that we're actually doing.